Rejoice, episode 65, Out of the Shell. Hello, I'm Frank Delaney. A boy named Sergeant, holding his homework book in his hand, has approached Stephen Dedalus in the classroom after all the other boys whom Stephen has been teaching have run off to play hockey. We're continuing with Chapter 2 of Ulysses. The homework subject is mathematics, and the word sums is written on Sergeant's book. Sergeant speaks first, and the dialogue between them this week then yields to Stephen's inner monologue. Here's the passage. Mr. Deasy told me to write them out all again, he said, and show them to you, sir. Stephen touched the edges of the book. Futility. Do you understand how to do them now? He asked. Numbers 11 to 15, Sergeant answered. Mr. Deasy said I was to copy them off the board, sir. Can you do them yourself? Stephen asked. No, sir. Ugly and futile, lean neck and thick hair, and a stain of ink, a snail's bed. Yet someone had loved him, borne him in her arms and in her heart. But for her, the race of the world would have trampled him underfoot, a squashed, boneless snail. She had loved his weak, watery blood drained from her own. Was that then real, the only true thing in life? End of quote. Wow. Ha! Okay then, here we go. The first two sentences are straightforward. Mr. Deasy told me to write them out all again. He said to show them to you. Mr. Deasy is the principal of the school. He's the Nestor of the chapter. He's modelled on a father-teacher-type character from Homer's Odyssey, and we'll meet him soon. I know I keep promising, but he's getting closer and closer. So Mr. Deasy told me to write them out all again. He said and show them to you, sir. Stephen touched the edges of the book. Fine. Then we have, yet again, the interruption of a one-word sentence that is not narrative. Futility. A single thought from Stephen. It could mean that it's futile for this boy to try and learn anything, such a reduced poor creature that he is. But wait, there's more. Hang tough with that word futility. The passage continues with Stephen asking poor young Sergeant if he knows any better how to do them now, and Sergeant not exhibiting any more intellectual acumen than an ability to copy the mathematical problems down off the blackboard. And when the boy, having copied them, still doesn't know how to do the sums, we go back into Stephen's thoughts, and this is where the rubber hits the road. First we have Stephen considering this unfortunate specimen of boyhood. Ugly and futile, lean neck and thick hair, and a stain of ink, a snail's bed, yet someone had loved him, borne him in her arms, in her heart. But for her, the race of the world would have trampled him underfoot, a squashed, boneless snail. Remember that Joyce in last week's passage also likened the ink stain on Sergeant's skin to a snail's bed. Now you know what I've often said here, that when James Joyce uses a word that stands out, look out. So, what's the significance of the word snail? And it's being used more than once. Well, there isn't any major classical or cultural allusion or reference connected to snails in play here. So let's look at the direct usage, because sometimes a cigar is just a cigar, and the fun of this is trying to divine what Joyce was thinking. The most obvious idea is the self-evident. Sergeant is slow. Such a shell as he has managed to retain will surely be stepped on, and yet a mother's love and care must have been present in his life at some stage. And now we begin to get where we should be going. Was that mother's love the only love Sergeant would have known? The only good reality in his life? This is terrific, we're about to straddle a merger of thoughts and feelings. A merger. Because the next sentences are, quote, she had loved his weak, watery blood drained from her own. Was that then real? The only true thing in life? Does the spoor of a snail look like weak, watery blood? From Sergeant's mother, we segue to Stephen's dead mother, and now down into the deeper recesses of what's going on here. We're looking here at a brilliant, literary way of portraying depression. Without ever saying that Stephen is depressed, Joyce is conveying it in the sadness and anxiety of his thoughts. Remember, Stephen is rent apart by twin emotions concerning his mother's death. There's sheer, skin-raw bereavement and loss, and then there's guilt at not having answered her call to pray for him, which led to Buck Mulligan's jibe that Stephen had effectively killed his mother. So, first of all, the word she in the sentence. She had loved his weak, watery blood drained from her own. She morphs across to include Stephen's mother as well as Sargent's. And secondly, Joyce has already nailed his colours to this mast because, in the book that preceded Ulysses, A Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man, the autobiographical Joyce, Stephen's friend and fellow student Cranley, the cranky, thin-lipped, rebarbative Cranley, has this to say after Stephen tells Cranley that he, Stephen, has had a bad quarrel with his mother. The quarrel was about religion, and Cranley delivers a reproach. Whatever else is on shore in this stinking dunghill of a world, he says, a mother's love is not. Your mother brings you into the world, carries you first in her body. What do we know about what she feels? But whatever she feels, it at least must be real. It must be. End of quote from A Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man. Now we're getting to it. Carries you first in her body, the womb as a snail's shell. So we do have a number of levels building up. We have the slowness, the sludginess, the repellent feelings a snail generates, the womb as shell, and, throw in for good measure, since so many snails are hermaphrodites, the hermaphrodite idea of a woman carrying a male child being at that time, during that pregnancy, both male and female. And, just to round it off, might a boneless snail not look like a fetus in the womb? No, not just quite to round it off. I'm going to toss in one more thing. If I didn't already know it, I'd have guessed that in a few paragraphs, Stephen will actually compare himself to the unfortunate, weak-eyed and depressed sergeant whom only a mother could have loved. But that's ahead of us. Rejoice, Episode 66, Mother Love. Hello, I'm Frank Delaney. Here's the first part of this week's quoting from the text. We're still in Chapter 2, and Stephen is watching, supervising a luckless, weak-eyed boy named Sargent, trying to master some elementary mathematics problems. His thoughts have been going to Sargent as being loved only by his mother. Who else could love this watery, snail-like creature? Stephen's considerations of Sargent and his mother meld with his own thoughts about his own mother, recently deceased. And here's the brief passage we're looking at this week, and I quote, "His mother's prostrate body the fiery Columbanus in holy zeal bestrode. She was no more, the trembling skeleton of a twig burnt in the fire, an odour of rosewood and wetted ashes. She had saved him from being trampled underfoot, and had gone, scarcely having been." That's the end of the quote. Short one, isn't it? And I apologize in advance to all of you who've been writing to me saying, can I please go a little faster? In my defense, I have to tell you, no, I can't. It's very dense. There's a lot of stuff, and you can't push a river. Hold on to your diplomas. There's a lot to consider. The first sentence is a thought of Stephen's. His mother's prostrate body, the fiery Columbanus in holy zeal bestrode. James Joyce had been in Paris when his mother entered her final illness. He had gone there, careless of her feelings. He'd gone wishing that he would grow into a medical student and a doctor, and a year or two later, in 1904, he would go again, as Stephen Dedalus would go abroad, a hopeful evangelist for art and beauty. That's the word we're going for, evangelist. The fiery Columbanus, according to legend, went into Europe to spread the Christian faith and abandoned his own mother in the process. And actually, it's more than legend. It's history. The fiery Columbanus. Now, who he? Well, there was actually a Saint Columbanus, a famous Irish monk of the 5th, 6th century. I once followed in his footsteps down through Europe for a book I wrote about the Dark Ages, and I didn't get to like him much. He was a bully, though he was always curing people of stuff. Or so they say. And I think that James Joyce probably while he was at school with the Jesuits, must have been taught about Columbanus's life, because the hagiography, the biography of Columbanus, which was written by a monk in Bobbio, Italy, where Columbanus founded a monastery, and where his body is naturally enough miraculously preserved, this monk Jonas had a great deal to say about Columbanus's mother and the womb, and more. Here's a quote from the said biography. "For when his mother, after having conceived, was bearing him in her womb, suddenly, in a tempestuous night, while she was buried in sleep, she saw the sun rise from her bosom, and issuing forth resplendent, furnish great light to the world." End of quote from Jonas of Bobbio. Well, yes, of course, but whatever this light, and however much this child meant to the mother, when Columbanus decided as a grown man to become an evangelist, and he did, he decided he was going to leave home completely, totally, and forever. Not surprisingly, Mamma objected. Here's Jonas of Bobbio again. "His mother in anguish begged him not to leave her, and placed herself in his way, and held the door. Weeping and stretched upon the floor, she said that she would not permit it. Then, leaping over both threshold and mother, he asked his mother not to give way to her grief. She would never see him again in this life, but wherever the way of salvation led him, there he would go." End of quote. Thank you, Jonas of Bobbio. So hence the sentence in Joyce's Ulysses. Stephen's thought, "His mother's prostrate body, the fiery Columbanus in holy zeal bestrode." Columbanus stepping over his mother, who lay down on the threshold to try and stop him go. And in there you have a neatly shaped and entire, self-contained capsule of Joycean reference, from a medieval history via Joyce's own first novel into a character study of Stephen in Ulysses. Now, I'm going to quote the 3 sentences of this week's passage again, because I want to draw your attention to something really clever. If ever a guy had literary smarts, that was old James E. Joyce. Forgive the repetition, but listen to this. "His mother's prostrate body, the fiery Columbanus in holy zeal bestrode. She was no more the trembling skeleton of a twig burnt in the fire, an odour of rosewood and wetted ashes. She had saved him from being trampled underfoot, and she had gone, scarcely having been." You've heard me say that already twice. That's enough. In the first sentence, he seems to morph his own mother into Columbanus's. In the second sentence, he could be talking about either mother, Columbanus's or his own. She was no more, when Columbanus never saw her again. Joyce's mother was no more, because she had just died. This is an echo of what we've been saying about Aristotle over the weeks. What's present is what is. Stephen tightens it further to include his own mother. "An odour of rosewood and wetted ashes," he says. Well, we've already been there, haven't we? Do you remember when Stephen is on the Martello Tower parapet, leaning on the granite, looking out to sea, trying not to be too goaded by Buck Mulligan? This is in the first chapter. And he thinks of his mother. And this is from the text at that point. "Silently, in a dream, she had come to him after her death, her wasted body within its loose brown grave clothes, giving off an odour of wax and rosewood, her breath that had bent upon him, mute, reproachful, a faint odour of wetted ashes." Unquote. Now here's the next sentence of this week. "She had saved him from being trampled underfoot, and had gone, scarcely having been." Well, it's all coming together now, isn't it? Of which mother is Stephen thinking? Columbanus's? His own? Or Sargent's? Well, Sargent's here. He's in school. His mother had evidently brought him into the world as a sentient little human being who could walk and talk and eat and drink. So in that respect she had indeed saved this snail-like son of hers from being squashed underfoot. Or is Stephen giving praise to his own mother for doing the same for him? She has indeed gone, a self-effacing, decent woman, as Joyce's mother was, hence the scarcely having been. It's the hallmark of a great artist to keep a number of strands running under the surface, as it were. Listen to a Bach partita, and note how many tunes he's got running there under the main theme, and forgive my coarseness in using the word tunes in relation to Bach. Look at Matisse's Atelier Rouge, and marvel at his multiple concerns in there, all over the place. Joyce does it all throughout Ulysses, and I'll point them up whenever I come across them. More rejoicing next week. Rejoice, episode 67, Dance Music. Hello, I'm Frank Delaney. We have some lumpy stuff coming up here in the second chapter of Ulysses. Actually, that's unfair. It's not lumpy. The prose, as ever, flows like fresh cream. What I'm calling lumpy includes any references worth unpacking to extract the maximum joy and learning from this mighty book, which is, after all, why I embarked on this exercise in the first place. Well, here's the first part of this week's quotation, and Stephen is still trying to teach the hapless boy Cyril Sargent and helping him with his problem understanding mathematics. But at the same time, Stephen's also thinking of how his own mother loved him, as Sargent's mother must have loved her snail-like small boy. And here, in this first sentence, we're listening to Stephen's bereaved thoughts, and they intermingle with factual descriptions throughout this first passage. Here we go, here's the quotation. A poor soul gone to heaven, and on a heath beneath winking stars, a fox, red reek of rapine in his fur, with merciless bright eyes, scraped in the earth, listened, scraped up the earth, listened, scraped and scraped. Sitting at his side, Stephen solved out the problem. He proves by algebra that Shakespeare's ghost is Hamlet's grandfather. Sargent peered askance through his slanted glasses. Hockey sticks rattled in the lumber room, the hollow knock of a ball, and calls from the field. That's the end of the quotation. Okay, here we go. Do you remember a few weeks ago? Riddle me, Randy out was in episode 63, if you want to refer back to it. The riddle was, the cock crew, the sky was blue, the bells in heaven were striking 11. 'Tis time for this poor soul to go to heaven. And the wild and enigmatic answer that Stephen gave to the schoolboys in the school was, the fox burying his grandmother under a holly bush. So, what's with the return of that reference and the scraping up of the earth? Well, he plainly repeats a poor soul gone to heaven as his mother's soul. And I love the red fox scraping. There's a reference in here somewhere, by the way, lurking in there, to Hamlet and the gravedigger. Alas, poor Yorick, I knew him well, and Hamlet's obsession with graves and the earth and death. But the red fox, if you grew up in Ireland, certainly in the Irish countryside where I did, you couldn't but be aware of foxes. I was fascinated by them as a small child. And the red reek of rapine was indeed reputed to be in the fox's fur, rapine meaning carrying off by force, as the fox, Mr. Fox, did with the chickens and the geese from the local farmers. But the fox as a creature, and as a creature in literature and in symbolism, had other renowns, and these are what Joyce is going for. The fox was clever. Clever fellow, Mr. Fox. Stephen considers himself a clever fellow, and the fox has, in mythology, great ties to the earth, and the fox can bring people, even goddesses, back to life. So, here you have something very interesting. One of the many fears attached to wolves is that they dig up human bodies and eat them. The fox, though, here, in Stephen's consideration, though savage and blood-stained in the pursuit of the food that he needs, isn't he attempting to bring someone back to life, which is why he listens after scraping, scraped in the earth, listened, scraped up the earth, listened, scraped and scraped? That's the quote. Stephen would, if he could overturn the emotional savagery he might well have inflicted on his devout dying mother when he refused to pray with her, he could, if he could, at all, bring her back to life. That's clear enough. And if you're wondering how he follows it with the sentence, he proves by algebra that Shakespeare's ghost is Hamlet's grandfather. If you're wondering why that's familiar, well, you heard it in episode 39, when Mulligan mockingly says of Stephen to Haynes the Englishman, "We have grown out of wild and paradoxes," that's Oscar. "We have grown out of wild and paradoxes. It's quite simple. He proves by algebra that Hamlet's grandson is Shakespeare's grandfather and that he himself is the ghost of his own father." And by the way, if I haven't said this before, I'd say it now, there's a lot about Hamlet and Shakespeare when we get farther into the forest of Ulysses. Next piece, straightforward, but again so clearly written that we see it. And again the reference to spectacles. Many, many such references in Ulysses. And we'll also come to the matter of Joyce's own dreadfully poor eyesight. Next piece in the quote you heard, Sargent peered askance through his slanted glasses. Hockey sticks rattled in the lumber room, the hollow knock of a ball and calls from the field. Well, that's fairly straightforward. And now we come to one of those brief passages in Ulysses that at first glance sends readers to the gin bottle. I'll quote it all, and then I'll sober you up, or try to. Here we go. Across the page, the symbols moved in grave morris, in the mummery of their letters, wearing quaint caps of squares and cubes. Give hands, traverse, bow to partner, so, imps of fancy of the Moors. Gone too from the world, Averroes and Moses Maimonides, dark men in mien and movement, flashing in their mocking mirrors the obscure soul of the world, a darkness shining in brightness, which brightness could not comprehend. Do you understand now? Can you work the second for yourself? Yes, sir. Well, figure that. Do you remember the old joke? Do you drink much? No, spill most of it. A horse walks into a bar and the barman says, "Why the long face?" Okay, I'm only joking. And I'm sorry for digressing, but once you get the joke, you'll get it. This really is Joyce at his quite obscure. Across the page the symbols moved in grave morris in the mummery of their letters, wearing quaint caps of squares and cubes. Give hands, traverse, bow to partner, so, imps of fancy of the Moors. Ha! He's showing off here, Joyce, the Jesuit schoolboy, he's showing off a little, he often does that. He's looking at an algebra problem, remember, that Sargent is copying down from the board. And he introduces the word Morris, M-O-R-R-I-C-E. Well, there's another spelling of that word, M-O-R-R-I-S, as in Morris dancing. So, the symbols on the page remind Stephen of that English folk dance, Morris dancing, except that Morris dancing isn't English. It takes its name from the people whence it comes, the Moors, that mighty Muslim people out of North Africa. In fact, Morris dancing takes its name from the spears the Moors used to carry, hence the sticks used in Morris dancing. And here, Joyce continues with the word mummery, which is, as you well know, a kind of folk play acting. So, we have, therefore, across the page the symbols moved in grave morris in the mummery of their letters, wearing quaint caps of squares and cubes, the symbols of algebra. And now Joyce adds some dance calling. Give hands, traverse, bow to partner. And then here comes the line. So, imps of fancy of the Moors. That's the kicker. Here's the smartest boy in the Jesuit class. Where does the word, and indeed the mathematical discipline of algebra, come from? You see, this is why I love this podcast job that I've given myself. And I know that Joyce probably learned all this at school in Ireland because I did. There was a form of algebra in existence since before Christ. But it didn't flourish, in part because the Greeks preferred geometry. And then, in 820 AD, a Muslim thinker and mathematician named Muhammad ibn Musa al-Khwarizmi published something called the Book of Summary regarding calculating by transposition and reduction. I'll give you that again. Wait for me. Muhammad ibn Musa al-Khwarizmi. And he published something called the Book of Summary regarding calculating by transposition and reduction. It, in essence, consolidated and improved upon existing algebraic principles and brought it further and further into wide use. And in the book's original title was the Arabic word al-Jabr, which means reunion. And by the way, al-Khwarizmi gave his own name to the word algorithm. So, I'm certain that what Joyce is up to here is that he's using what he learned at school. But he mentioned two names there. Did you catch them? Who were they? Gone too from the world, Averroes and Moses Maimonides, dark men in mien and movement, flashing in their mocking mirrors the obscure soul of the world, a darkness shining in brightness, which brightness could not comprehend. What's that about? That's going to need almost an entire podcast to unravel, and that'll be next week, wouldn't it? See you then. Rejoice, episode 68, a trio of dudes. Hello, I'm Frank Delaney. We're still in Chapter 2. I left you hanging last week with a pair of dudes. A student today might call them, a gambler might call them a pair of aces. Here they are from Joyce's text, and watch out for a third. Here's the quote. Gone too from the world, Averroes and Moses Maimonides, dark men in mien and movement, flashing in their mocking mirrors the obscure soul of the world, a darkness shining in brightness which brightness could not comprehend. End of quote. Now, you know where we are. We're still in the school. Stephen is still with the boy sergeant, who is not very competent and who's copying down things from the board, algebra, as the head teacher, Mr. Decius, told him to do, and Stephen is supervising him. And we hear Stephen's thoughts. Gone too refers to Stephen's recently deceased mother, of whom he has been thinking, Mary Didymus, and gone too also refers to the inventor of algebra, or at least the formalizer of algebra, the 9th century Muslim thinker and mathematician. But who are Averroes and Moses Maimonides? Dark men in mien and movement, flashing in their mocking mirrors the obscure soul of the world. Well, on one level, this is, of course, a touch showy again, but there's a neat tying up of loose ends here, and Joyce does this a lot. He opens up strands of thought and inquiry, runs them for a little while, and then ties little securing knots in them as he goes along, while they may still be floating to some degree, and they go from chapter to chapter sometimes, and sometimes you will find later in the book something that he dwelt with at length and lived with in chapter 1. Here's what I mean in this particular case. We've been having a lot of Aristotle, as you notice in the last several weeks. Aristotle's name has come up over and over again, philosophical concepts, actual quotes from Aristotle, and so on and so forth. And Averroes is the name by which Europeans know the 12th century Muslim commentator on Aristotle, Abu Iwalid Muhammad bin Ahmad bin Rust. Moses Maimonides was a 12th century Jewish scholar, also steeped in Aristotle and the Greek philosophers. And if you want to nudge towards other connections in Joyce's mind, one of the major formative emotional moments in Maimonides' life was the death of his brother, who died how? In an accident at sea. He drowned. And hasn't Stephen, before he thinks of Maimonides, hasn't Stephen just been hearing and thinking of Milton's poem Lycidas, about a friend of Milton's who also drowned in a shipping accident? You see, it echoes. He's like a damn pinball machine. You pull the lever, and boom, 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 boom. There are connections bouncing all over the place. But why were Averroes and Maimonides, these two philosophers, one Muslim, one Jewish, why were they, quote, dark men in mien and movement, flashing in their mocking mirrors the obscure soul of the world, a darkness shining in brightness which brightness could not comprehend? Here's why. First of all, they were Middle Eastern, both of the Semitic races, dark-haired, dark-eyed. That takes care of the word mien, M-I-E-N, by the way. I love that word. You don't hear it anymore. I suppose it's because it's one of those words that sounds as though it has a different meaning. M-I-E-N. And the words of Joyce, in movement, both were suspect. Both these men were suspect in their own worlds. To the faiths into which they were born, they were seen as less than respectable, because each of them allowed the possibility of other philosophies into their thinking. And it's not too strong to say that there were people in both their religions, Muslim and Judaism, who accused them of necromancy, because many people who were considered heretics back in the Middle Ages were accused of witchcraft or sorcery. That takes care of the phrase mocking mirrors. The next phrase, though, the next phrase is a bit more remote from our immediate reach. Here it is again. Flashing in their mocking mirrors, the obscure soul of the world, a darkness shining in brightness, which brightness could not comprehend. End of quote. This is, I think, without question, Jesuit teaching. And here, in that phrase, the obscure soul of the world, comes the third dude that I hinted at, also a thinker. There's a square in Rome that I love, the Piazza Navona. Many people love it. And I love it for 3 reasons. It has not 1, not 2, but 3 wonderful fountains. Second reason, it has the best ice cream in the world. Now, there's an argument to be had. And the third reason, I can, from the Piazza Navona, slip into another piazza nearby, the Campo dei Fiori. And there I can stand and think about one of my all-time heroes, that stirring fellow, Filippo Giordano Bruno. Bruno was everything that I like. He was a rebel, a thinker, a wanderer, an iconoclast, and he was something I'd love to have been, an astronomer. And he's largely credited with developing the thought that the sun is a star and that we're only one of a number of solar systems. In other words, that there is life in space. Now, what's this Middle Ages character got to do with Joyce and Stephen Dedalus in Chapter 2 of Ulysses, teaching mathematics to a poor dull boy named Sargent? Here's what. Oh, wow, there's elegant grammar for you. Here's what. Joyce was a big fan of Bruno. And this quote, "The obscure soul of the world," is taken directly from Bruno's philosophy. He believed the world had its own soul, just as humans are supposed to have, and though we may not be able to see it in its obscurity, it orders the universe, it controls the universe. That, of course, is a ridiculously shorthand version, and as I've said before, I only have a quarter of a century or so to get through all this, and if I had more time, I would right now be delving into the quotes from the Gospels of John, now referred to here by Joyce, and so laden with meaning would be here until Tuesday week. But here's the paraphrasing, and I'll just touch on it. "In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was with God in the beginning. Through him all things were made. Without him nothing was made that has been made. In him was life, and that life was the light of all mankind. The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness has not overcome it." Joyce's quote is, "A darkness shining in brightness, which brightness could not comprehend." And here we are, back in the same territory of Father and Son, God and Jesus, the opening of the Gospel of St. John, and sneakily, Joyce has his own belief implied there, his belief in the Word. Not the word is used to denote Christ, but the power of the Word in language. That's Joyce. By the way, Bruno was burnt as a heretic. There's a statue to him in Rome. And just let's end in something simple, something very clear that needs no explanation. This is Stephen speaking to the boy Sargent. "Do you understand now? Can you work the second for yourself?" "Yes, sir." In long, shaky strokes, Sargent copied the data. End of quote, and there we leave it until next week. Read Joyce, Episode 69, Dark Palaces. Hello, I'm Frank Delaney. Stephen is about to conclude his teaching, such as it is, of the weak and feeble boy Sargent, who has now begun to copy down the algebra problems he has been set by the school's principal, Mr. Deasy, who, by the way, is so close I can almost feel his hot breath on my neck. Here, though, is this week's brief passage. Once again, expect some density. We're watching Sargent writing, and we'll hear Stephen's thoughts as he watches. Here's the quote. "Waiting always for a word of help, his hand moved faithfully the unsteady symbols, a faint hue of shame flickering behind his dull skin. Amor matris, subjective and objective genitive. With her weak blood and whey-sour milk she had fed him, and hid from sight of others his swaddling bands. Like him was I, these sloping shoulders, this gracelessness. My childhood bends beside me, too far for me to lay a hand there once or lightly. Mine is far, and his secret as our eyes. Secrets, silent, stony, sit in the dark palaces of both our hearts. Secrets weary of their tyranny, tyrants willing to be dethroned." End of quote. Right, now bear with me. There's a lot here, and we'll take it sentence by sentence. First sentence first. Waiting always for a word of help, his hand moved faithfully the unsteady symbols, a faint hue of shame flickering behind his dull skin. The boy labours as Stephen, who is only a temporary teacher, and in fact Joyce himself didn't stay in that role for very long, as Stephen watches over him doing the algebra exercise, and the boy is embarrassed at everything to do with this. The unsteady symbols, those are the X, Y, and Z of algebra. Second sentence. Amor matris, subjective and objective genitive. Here is Joyce in Stephen's silent thoughts, wearing his own Joyceness on his sleeve. I love him. He's openly using an ambiguity. The Latin term amor matris, amor love, matris of mother. What's he saying here? That it cuts both ways? Ha! That's the least of it. This brief phrase, and it will appear later, has a crucial bearing on characterization and even plot, and even thematically, and on the way Joyce's mind worked. First of all, and most obviously, it means two things. It means the love of a mother for her child, as witness Sargent's mother's love for her son, with which we've been dealing over the past few weeks, and Stephen's own mother's love for him. And then, to turn it back to face itself, it means the son's love for the mother, love of the mother, amor matris, love of mother. Now, in any other writer, it would be, to say the least, interesting, this deliberate manipulation of the ambiguity in the term. Here, however, consider this. In the book that precedes and paves the way for Ulysses, A Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man, the mother figure has major importance. From her early closeness to the timid boy-child that is Stephen, to the clash of spirits at the end when Stephen will not bow to his mother's Catholic will. In Homer's Odyssey, Penelope is not only the faithful wife of Odysseus/Ulysses, she's the mother of the young man Telemachus. And we have Mother of God, and Mother of Jesus, and Mother Church, and Mother Ireland. It's all in there. Amor matris, love of mother. Third sentence from this week's quote. With her weak blood and whey sour milk, she had fed him, and hid from sight of others his swaddling bands. Now, from the unusual elliptical shape of that sentence, you just know that something is going on, and it is. Remember, a few weeks ago, we were dealing constantly, and really have been on and off since the beginning of the book, dealing with the works of William Blake, the 18th century English poet, artist, and thinker. Here's part of a poem by Blake called Infant Sorrow. It's one of his songs of experience, which I love. Songs of innocence and experience. If you haven't read them lately, go back to them. It's really well worth a visit. Here's the quote. My mother groaned, wrote Blake, my father wept. Into the dangerous world I leapt, helpless, naking, piping loud, like a fiend hid in a cloud. Struggling in my father's hands, striving against my swaddling bands, bound and weary, I thought best to sulk upon my mother's breast. There you have it. Hid from sight of others his swaddling bands. So, neat as a safety pin, Joyce ties everything together. The weakness of Sargent, the schoolboy as an infant, Joyce's own timid weakness as an infant and as a small boy, mother love, and the two-way anguish it embodies. And we're not done yet. Next three sentences in that quote, they're short, here we go. Like him was I, these sloping shoulders, this gracelessness. My childhood bends beside me, too far from me to lay a hand there once or lightly. Well, Stephen is fairly obviously comparing himself to poor, weak Sargent, the schoolboy sitting beside him. The early reaches of A Portrait of the Artist tells you how feeble Joyce thought his own early childhood. There's huge emotional pain going on here. Look at the words, these sloping shoulders, this gracelessness. At the sentence, my childhood bends beside me, leading to the sentiment, too far from me to lay a hand there once or lightly. But Sargent, the squashed, inept, poor-sighted boy, is reminding Stephen of those weak and timid days. And in the next two sentences, Stephen, whose utter loneliness, we'll encounter again and again in Ulysses, briefly joins forces with Sargent. The teacher joins the pupil. Mine is far, he thinks, and his secret as our eyes. Mine is far, and his secret as our eyes. My childhood is far in the past, and Sargent's secret as our eyes. Both of them have sight problems. And listen to this. Secrets, this is the concluding line, secrets, silent, stony, sit in the dark palaces of both our hearts, secrets weary of their tyranny, tyrants willing to be dethroned. End of quote. The words secrets, silent, and stony, yes, understandable Joyceanisms and alliterations, and not unusual, but I stopped at the phrase dark palaces. And I thought to myself, there is definitely something going on here. But where have I heard that before? And I remembered. I'd heard it at school, at secondary school, high school. And this is where I came across the phrase. There was an Irish poet. She was highly current and visible in Joyce's time. Her name was Alice Milligan. And she was an Irish nationalist activist, and she founded a magazine that she called the Shan Van Vught, translated as the poor old woman, and we had that reference in chapter 1. Remember the old woman who comes to the Martello Tower with the milk? She's in episode 39. She was a metaphor for old Ireland, as was the Shan Van Vught, the poor old woman. Shan is old, Van is the genitive of ban, meaning woman, and Buck, the Vught, means old. Well, Alice Milligan wrote a poem. Ah, boy, this just gets better and better. Alice Milligan wrote a poem called The Dark Palace. There beams no light from thy hall tonight, O house of fame. No mead vat seethes, and no smoke upwreathes o'er the heart's red flame. It's a poem of devastation and loss. It shows the inside of a noble place, deserted and lovely, in a word, bereft. Her poems have a lot of doom and gloom, and there may be a little stab of satire here. Because is Joyce equating Stephen's grief over his mother and Sargent's haplessness with those who mourned Ireland's political bereftness? Think about it, and come back here next week. Rejoice, episode 70. At last, Nestor. Hello, I'm Frank Delaney. Stephen has finished his teaching and is about to end his supervision of the boy sergeant. We're in chapter 2 of Ulysses, themed by the Homeric wise man and mentor figure named Nestor in Homer's Odyssey, and at last we're just about to meet Joyce's equivalent of Nestor. And as a moment of light relief, so to speak, our first passage, this week's passage, needs no application. It's just vehicular narrative carrying the story along in clear, simple, picture-making English. Here's the quote, and it's a long one by our standards here. Sargent has been doing an algebra problem. There won't be much explication needed here. Here we go. The sum was done. It is very simple, Stephen said as he stood up. Yes, sir, thanks, Sargent answered. He dried the page with a sheet of thin blotting paper and carried his copybook back to his bench. You'd better get your stick and go out to the others, Stephen said, as he followed towards the door the boy's graceless form. Yes, sir. In the corridor his name was heard, called from the playfield. Sergeant! Run on, Stephen said. Mr. Deasy is calling you. He stood in the porch and watched the laggard hurry toward the scrappy field where sharp voices were in strife. They were sorted in teams, and Mr. Deasy came away stepping over wisps of grass with gaitered feet. When he had reached the schoolhouse, voices again contending called to him. He turned his angry white moustache. What is it now? He cried, continually without listening. Cochrane and Halliday are on the same side, sir, Stephen said. Will you wait in my study for a moment? Mr. Deasy said. Till I restore order here? And as he stepped fussily back across the field, his old man's voice cried sternly, What is the matter? What is it now? Their sharp voices cried about him on all sides. Their many forms closed round him, the garish sunshine bleaching the honey of his ill-dyed head. End of quote. And that almost, I think, falls into the longest and fewest category, the longest single piece of text I've read so far with the fewest complexities. What you see is what you get, and God knows you can't say that often about Ulysses, where most of the time you don't get what you see, which, as we now know, was, of course, deliberate on Joyce's part. That was where he got his kicks. Let me just have a quick look back at it to make sure he hasn't snuck something in there. There's a word Joyce might have liked, snuck. Past tense of sneaked, is it? I don't think so, but it's meant to be. Let me see, just 2 notes, and then I want to say something more general, though still particular to this chapter. First of all, and this is about technique, have you noticed the changing points of view here? So risky. So few people bring it off. First we see a hint of Stephen's thought, quote, as he followed towards the door the boy's graceless form. That is, after all, essentially Stephen's observation, a continuation of what he has been thinking about this poor boy, Cyril Sargent. And here's the next bit, I'll repeat it. He stood in the porch and watched the laggard hurry towards the scrappy field where sharp voices were in strife. They were sorted in teams, and Mr. Deasy came away, stepping over wisps of grass with gaitered feet. When he had reached the schoolhouse, voices again contending called to him. He turned his angry white moustache. What is it now? He cried continually without listening, unquote. Well, it's plain that we're reading Stephen watching what's going on, the beginnings of a field hockey game, which the headmaster, being already established here as a cranky and irascible man, might or might not be refereeing. And look what do we know about him from that snatch of narrative, which is both Joyce and Stephen all at once. We learn his name, Mr. DC. We see that he's wearing gaiters. He has a white mustache, and he's irritable. There's also a tiny hint here of something we've been discussing for several weeks. The idea of reality being something that you see at the time you see it. Mr. DC utters that most common of irritated questions, often used by parents to children, teachers to students. What is it now? Now, that's the word there. That's the key word. And we know one more thing about him. He dyes his hair, and he can't afford to have it well done. It's honey-coloured and ill-dyed. The line is, the garish sunshine bleaching the honey of his ill-dyed head. Okay. Yes, that's Mr. DC. Now, I promised you a general note. I think you'll agree that we've had a fairly intense few weeks, months indeed, of deeply referenced text. In the actual book, though, it only lasts a few pages. And it's truly the first time that we've been so deeply marred in double, triple, quadruple, multiple hidden references in a single phrase or sentence, not to mention the many variations in literary technique. And now what do we have? As I've just read you, after the intensity, a little calm and transparency. Here's my point. Joyce, who was a fine singer and loved music, wrote this stuff. Call it prose if you like, I think it's poetry as well. Wrote Ulysses like you'd write music, the convoluted passages followed by the simplicity, a place to rest the brain after he's worked the hell out of it. He doesn't always do it, and he doesn't do it that often, but sometimes he does it at length. Wait until we get to the funeral chapter. We'll zip through a lot of that. By and large, though, open Ulysses at a random page and feel the furrows in your brow deepen as you puzzle it out. And we shall be doing that, puzzling it out here again next week when Mr. DC Nestor stands center stage. Rejoice, episode 71 of Coins and Spoons. Hello, I'm Frank Delaney. Let me go straight to this week's first passage of quotation. Stephen is waiting in the headmaster's study for Mr. DC. Here's the quote. Stale, smoky air hung in the study, with the smell of drab, abraded leather of its chairs. As on the first day, he bargained with me here, as it was in the beginning, is now. On the sideboard, the tray of Stuart coins, base treasure of a bog, and ever shall be. And snug in their spoon case of purple plush faded the 12 apostles, having preached to all the Gentiles, world without end. A hasty step over the stone porch and in the corridor. Blowing out his rare moustache, Mr. DC halted at the table. First, our little financial settlement, he said. Some fun to be had here. We're almost halfway through Chapter 2 of Ulysses. We have a nice description of Mr. DC's study. Good word here, the drab abraded leather of its chairs, abraded, from the Latin word radere, rassum, to scrape, to wear down, to wear away. And Stephen is looking at leather chairs that people have been using for years and years. He remembers the study as it was on the first day Mr. DC hired him, as on the first day he bargained with me here. And in those wonderful little straggles of thought that Joyce is so good at, little wisps and runnels of connection, he flicks to a prayer connection. As it was in the beginning, is now, and he'll go on to, and ever shall be, and he'll get to world without end. It's a gloomy idea, because Stephen is gloomy, and he's thinking, this eternal, this never-ending teaching arrangement and money involved. This is a neat little antique of Joyce's. The words come from a prayer that all Irish Catholic children learned, the Gloria. We used to call it the Glory be to the Father, or if you were an altar boy, in Latin, the Gloria Patri, because it went Gloria Patri et Filio et Spiritui Sancto, sicut erat in principio et nunc et semper et in saecula saeculorum. Amen. Glory be to the Father, the Son, and the Holy Ghost, as it was in the beginning, is now, and ever shall be, world without end. Amen. Point taken, yeah? And there's more. This is James Joyce, after all. Now, the entire novel has a skein of theme running through it about fathers and sons. I've said this before. It's worth repeating. Most notably and evidently Hamlet and his dead father, the King of Denmark, and God the Father and his crucified Son, Jesus Christ, which will result in Stephen himself being perceived as a young man in search of a father, as we had in chapter 1. And here we have Stephen in the study of a father figure, the headmaster of a school, and he's thinking, glory be to the Father. Ironic, of course, but nonetheless present in Stephen's thoughts and making the continuing fathers and sons point. Now, there's something here about to happen that's well worth thinking about. We'll watch together, and I'll keep drawing your attention to it. But this next segment of Ulysses, from now to the end of the chapter, it gives us a very good and clear example of how Joyce used Homer's Odyssey as his parallel, but with his own twist on it. Nestor, in the Odyssey, is a complex character. He's a man who mentors many younger men. A man of seemingly good advice and delightful with words. A man of hospitality and generosity to the younger men. Let's observe, though, what Joyce does with him, and we encounter Joyce's very considerable powers of irony. We have a clue straight away in Mr. Deasy's study. On the sideboard, and it's half, by the way, do you notice, half between Joyce's narrative and Stephen's thoughts. On the sideboard, the tray of Stuart coins, base treasure of a bog, and ever shall be. And snug in their spoon case of purple plush, faded the 12 apostles, having preached to all the Gentiles, world without end. I don't know how international readers ever manage to deal with this stuff, because there's so much of it you wouldn't know unless you'd grown up in Ireland. I mean, this is political. The tray of Stuart coins, for example, that has a number of levels in it, all political. The Stuarts were Bonnie Prince Charlie, of course, the pretenders to the Scottish throne. Many would say, no, not pretenders, rightful heirs. The romance of Bonnie Prince Charlie and the sadness of Culloden and the defeat of the Scottish clans in the 45 rebellion, 1745. All of that was still highly alive in Joyce's time. I, as a schoolboy, reading boys' books in Ireland, I was highly aware of it. Bonnie Prince Charlie was a figure in my childhood imagination. The Stuart cause was, of course, highly popular in Ireland, with a huge identification there with anyone who wanted to break England's rule. But as for relics of them, well, they're now no more than coins found in a bog, and the word base indicates their worthlessness, because the Stuarts aren't kings. They never were kings. Well, they were, but they lost it. And even when they were, they debased Ireland's coinage deliberately as an economic measure. And these base coins, they're in the possession of a man who, as we shall see, is actually an England sympathizer. A West Briton, they used to call them. Tremendous insult. Or is he? What is he exactly? Well, we know, though, that he owns something that just might identify his religion. A set of apostle spoons. I know them well. Have you ever seen a set? I've seen them often. They're a christening gift. They're small spoons, like little teaspoons. Maybe even sauce spoons, tiny things. And in the upper handle of each is the figure, sometimes in enamel, sometimes in carving, the figure of one of the apostles with his name beneath: Peter, Andrew, James the Greater, John, Philip, Bartholomew, Thomas, Matthew, James the Less, Jude, Simon Zelotes, and, now comes the kicker, we always counted the spoons and we always looked, is there a Judas? Well, of course there wasn't a Judas. He was replaced as he was in life by Matthias. And sometimes there was in those little sets, those little boxed sets, in a little case, a black leather case with a purple or red plush inside it, there was a 13th spoon, Christ himself. But that's not the point, really. That's just background I'm giving you there. The point is, why has Joyce got them here? Because, as he well knew, they were in Protestant houses only. So he's immediately telling us something about Mr. Deasy. That Mr. Deasy has collected coinage which once debased Ireland, and that he might not be one of the majority Catholic population. And he has a moustache. And there's money in the relationship between him and Stephen Dedalus. Of which more next week. Rejoice, episode 72A. Hello, I'm Frank Delaney. And here let me try something with you that you might find useful. As you know by now, I offer after every 12th episode an extra kind of bonus podcast, hence the A72A. And it typically has nothing to do with the text through which we're currently traveling in the ordinary weekly podcasts. I mean these bonuses as additional illuminations to Ulysses, or to Joyce himself. And the last time I did it, I began to tell you about Frank Budgeon, an English painter who was a close friend of Joyce's in Zurich. I'm going to continue here with Budgeon because he gave the most accessible account of Joyce. The wonderful book that he wrote was called James Joyce and the Making of Ulysses. And if you want to compile these bonus editions as a kind of mini portrait of Joyce, start with that one, that episode 60A, and this one, 72A, will naturally follow because I'm going to pick up where I left off. And by the way, earlier ones, all of them have the A suffix. They all are about Joyce's life or his biography or the writing of the book or whatever. And as I say, 72A will naturally follow because I'm going to pick up where I left off on 60A. Clear? I hope so. Clear as mud, I hear you, chortle. By the way, did you know that the word chortle was invented by Lewis Carroll for Through the Looking Glass in 1871? Alice in Wonderland again. Lewis Carroll wanted a portmanteau word that would combine the words chuckle and snort, hence chortle. All right then, enough fun. I left you on episode 60A with this. He, that's Joyce, asked Frank Budgeon this question. Do you know of any complete all-round character presented by any writer? They discussed many fictional creations, Balzac to Shakespeare, and upon whom did they settle? Well, Balzac didn't do it for Joyce, nor did Flaubert, nor Tolstoy, nor Dostoevsky even. Not complete enough for him, nor even Shakespeare himself. Here's Budgeon speaking. What about Faust, then, I said. And then as a second shot, or Hamlet? Joyce replied that Faust isn't a complete man. He isn't a man at all. Is he an old man or a young man? Where are his home and family? We don't know. And he can't be complete because he's never alone. Mephistopheles is always hanging around him, at his side or his heels. And Budgeon then remarks, it was easy to see the answer in Joyce's mind to his own question. In other words, Joyce posed the question rhetorically because he knew what he was going to say. He had thought it through. The answer was, no surprise, Ulysses, or, in the Greek version, Odysseus. Son to Laertes, father to Telemachus, husband to Penelope, lover of Calypso, a draft dodger first, then a warrior, a gentleman who knew not to appear naked in front of a lady. And Joyce claimed that because Odysseus invented the wooden horse of Troy, he can also be credited with inventing the military tank, because, said Joyce, they were, after all, both shells containing armed warriors. That was how Joyce saw Odysseus. Now, here's one of the moments that I most relish in Joyce's life and in Budgeon's book. You've heard me about this before, I think, but what the hell, it's worth repeating, because it's so interesting. It begins with a description of another meeting between them, and again we have Budgeon's painterly eye, and here's the quotation from Budgeon's book. A cold wind was blowing when I met Joyce one evening on the Bahnhofstrasse. The brown overcoat buttoned up to his chin lent him a somewhat military appearance. The two men chatted. Budgeon thanked Joyce for having sent across a copy of a portrait of the artist, and then Budgeon inquired about the work in progress, which was, of course, Ulysses. How's it going? Joyce said, I've been working hard on it all day. Budgeon asked, does that mean you've written a great deal? Joyce said, 2 sentences. Aha, said Budgeon, or something like that. You have been seeking the mot juste, the perfect word. No, said Joyce, I have the words. What I am seeking is the perfect order of words in the sentence. There is an order, in every way appropriate. I think I have it. What are the words? Budgeon asked, and this is Joyce's reply. I believe I told you, he said, that my book is a modern odyssey. Every episode in it corresponds to an adventure of Ulysses. I am now writing the Lestrygonians episode, which corresponds to the adventures of Ulysses with the cannibals. My hero is going to lunch. But there's a seduction motive in the Odyssey, the cannibal king's daughter. Seduction appears in my book as women's silk petticoats hanging in a shop window. The words through which I express the effect of it on my hungry hero are, quote, perfume of embraces all him assailed, with hungered flesh obscurely, he mutely craved to adore. And Joyce then adds, you can see for yourself in how many different ways they can be arranged. Well, they can, if you're James A. Joyce. I just repeat the two sentences to you because it's worth trying to get into his mind at this moment and see the sentences as he saw them. Here it is. Here they are. Perfume of embraces, all him assailed. Period. With hungered flesh obscurely, he mutely craved to adore. Period. No commas, no punctuation, just a full point between the two sentences. Now, in the Odyssey, the Lestrygonians are cannibals, and I want one day to visit the caves of Norway where they were supposed to have lived, this race of cannibal giants, and where archaeologists claim to have found unusually large human bones, which would support the ancient historical theory that there were cannibal giants living in the caves of Norway. But I'm digressing, so let me return to Budgeon and Joyce. You see how many ideas he triggers? It's exhausting. The meeting between Budgeon and Joyce, this was a meeting of minds between two artists, and Budgeon was more than equal to it. What surprised him was not that Joyce laboured so hard to bring forth so little, because Budgeon said that many a painter can labour for a day or for many days on 1 or 2 square inches of canvas. No, what he divined was that, as he put it, a new province of material had been found by Joyce. Isn't that a lovely phrase? A new province of material. And almost as soon as Budgeon had the thought, which he didn't speak out loud, Joyce turned to him and began to address it, as if he had somehow ingested Budgeon's thought telepathically. He told Budgeon that his book was an epic of the human body. In my book, he said, oh my God, am I grateful to Budgeon for writing all this down? Ha! In my book, Joyce said, the body lives in and moves through space and is the home of a full human personality. The words I write are adapted to express first one of its functions, and then another, in Lestrygonians, which, by the way, we haven't come to yet in the podcast, but we shall. In Lestrygonians, said Joyce, the stomach dominates. And then, he made this killer remark, a lesson for all writers of prose. He said, I want the reader to understand always through suggestion rather than direct statement. To which Frank Budgeon replied, that's the painter's form of leverage. And there you have it, a sound and strong exchange between two people who understand art and its secret mysteries, its magics. As he describes in the book, Budgeon goes on to read Ulysses and become a closer friend to Joyce. He meets Joyce's unmarried wife, or common-law wife, Nora Barnacle, from the west of Ireland, and Joyce's 2 children, Lucia and Giorgio, both of whom, despite early promise, Giorgio was a champion swimmer, went on to live difficult, even tragic lives. The family language, as Budgeon overheard it, was either Italian or more commonly the local dialect in Zurich called Zuriduch, or I suppose Zurich German. And Nora was afraid that Joyce, in talking so intensely to Budgeon about Ulysses, would bore him stiff, she said. Well, he didn't bore Budgeon stiff, and we are the richer for it. You see, the thing about Ulysses that Budgeon got, and perhaps a painter would see it better than anyone else, the thing is this. Ulysses is most essentially a book of details. That remark of Joyce's, I want the reader to understand always through suggestion rather than direct statement, that lives, that resides in his text. You can't do it in more commercial writing, which increasingly has to be on the nose, no subtlety, no complexity. Joyce, however, by giving us a welter of detail about that single day in Dublin, June the 16th, 1904, he did what literature does best. He created an entire world, a universe, a multi-layered living. Now, anyone who writes fiction for a living knows that that is the game. You have to make a world, and you have to make people who live in that world. The freedom to do so is wonderful, wonderful. But the task is enormous if you want to do it well. Joyce, you see, knew truly that the devil is in the details, and by giving us such a detailed picture of Dublin and its people on that sunny day, he also gave us a beating heart and a true sense of humanity. Here's an observation of Budgeon's from much later in the book. He's talking about the interior monologue, the stream of consciousness that Joyce employs for Stephen You've already heard it, and which, as you will hear soon, he employs in detail from Mr. Leopold Bloom. And this is what Budgeon says about that written-down thinking used as a form of narrative. He says, "It's like an impressionist painting. The shadows are full of colour. The whole is built up out of nuances instead of being constructed in broad masses. Things are seen as immersed in a luminous fluid. Colour supplies the modelling and the total effect." And here's the key phrase in his description: "The total effect is arrived at through a countless number of small touches." A countless number of small touches. Well, quite so. We've already seen that in the myriad tiny details in Chapter 1 of Ulysses, and at the moment as we go through Chapter 2, down to the clash of hockey sticks heard from a distance, or the apostle spoons, or the coins in Mr. Deasy's office. And Budgeon adds a final remark to that thought. He says, "Like Impressionist art, or any other art for that matter, it is an effort to approach reality." And that's really the point. It's the point of this special bonus edition. And that really is what Joyce did. And that's really why Ulysses is so compelling. We know from the detail in that book what it was like to walk the streets of Dublin on a summer day 107 years ago. This has been a bonus edition of Read Joyce. Normal service will be resumed on Wednesday next. Read Joyce, episode 72, Shells and Shillings. Hello, I'm Frank Delaney. We stopped last week just as Mr. Deasy, the headmaster and the Nestor of James Joyce's modelling, or rather remodelling, of Homer's Odyssey, just as Mr. Deasy was reminding Stephen Didymus, the Telemachus of Homer, of their little financial settlement. I'll overlap that quote with this week's. Here goes. "First, our little financial settlement," he said. He brought out of his coat a pocketbook, bound by a leather thong. It snapped open, and he took from it 2 notes, one of joined halves, and laid them carefully on the table. "2," he said, strapping and stowing his pocketbook away. And now his strong room for the gold. Stephen's embarrassed hand moved over the shells, heaped in the cold stone mortar. Whelks and money cowries and leopard shells, and this whorled as an emir's turban, and this the scallop of St. James, an old pilgrim's hoard, dead treasure, hollow shells. A sovereign fell, bright and new, on the soft pile of the tablecloth. End of quotation. Now let's look at it. The transaction is clear enough. Mr. Deasy is paying Stephen for his hours of teaching at the school. Mr. Deasy has a wallet or pocketbook. Note, by the way, and you'll see this all through, note that Joyce never passes up on a chance to use the word book. And we can tell that Mr. Deasy is a man careful about money because the pocketbook, the wallet, is bound by a leather thong. Not only that, one of the banknotes that he takes from the wallet has been put back together, one of joined halves, having obviously been torn or damaged in its long journey around the world. Or else Mr. Deasy has had it in his pocketbook for so long that it frayed apart. He puts the banknotes down on the table, identifying them as £2. By the way, there's something political going on here too. Something colonial. Colonial was a favourite target of Joyce's, and I'll come to that in a moment. The next paragraph is, I'll requote it, "And now his strong room for the gold. Stephen's embarrassed hand moved over the shells heaped in the cold stone mortar, whelks and money cowries and leopard shells, and this whorled as an emir's turban, and this the scallop of St. James, an old pilgrim's hoard, dead treasure, hollow shells." I looked at this for several minutes to try and figure it out. This is Stephen thinking, and it's Joyce narrating, all in one paragraph. Well, we're used to that. His strong room for the gold. What's going on here? Is Stephen imagining a miser because Mr. Deasy is about to produce some gold coin? And what's this line? Stephen's embarrassed hand moved over the shells, heaped in the cold stone mortar, whelks and money cowries and leopard shells, and this whorled as an emir's turban, and this the scallop of St. James, followed by the line, an old pilgrim's hoard, dead treasure, hollow shells. Well, now, this is really cool. This is sweet. I thought, first of all, when I looked at it, that maybe the walls of the school had been plastered and decorated with shells, stuck into the plaster, into the mortar. But no, I looked at it again, and this is what it is. On Mr. Deasy's desk, there's a mortar made of stone, a mortar such as an ancient pharmacist might use with a pestle, and in it Mr. Deasy has placed his little private collection of shells, what he picked up on the seashore. Shells from what we call seafood, whelks and cowries, and a leopard shell. You know what a leopard shell looks like. It's a shell with little leopard markings on it, and a scallop shell. And here's one of the points arising. Shells in primitive tribes, as you know this, have been used as money, especially cowrie shells. And here we are in the middle of a financial transaction. And there's that shell, unnamed but described as whorled as an emir's turban. Can't you just see it? An emir from the Middle East, an Arab leader with a turban, and the shell is whorled like the turban. And the scallop of St. James. Now that's especially interesting if you know Dublin. The legend is that when James the Apostle left the Holy Land after Christ's death to spread Christ's gospel, his ship foundered off the coast of Spain. But James staggered ashore, and had been so long immersed in the salt water that he was encrusted with scallop shells. So again, by the way, as we had earlier with Milton and Lycidas, we have a shipwreck and somebody foundering in the sea. Now the place where James landed in Spain is called Santiago de Compostela, St. James of the Field of Stars, because he was guided to that spot on the shore by stars that fell to earth. And all over Europe, since the year 33 AD, when Christ was crucified and the apostles scattered, pilgrims walk to Santiago on the St. James pilgrimage. They walk from all over Europe, and they carry a scallop shell, which is used by them as a drinking vessel. And if you go to Santiago in northern Spain, you will see that pretty well all the houses in the centre of town, the old city, have scallop shell motifs. And in Dublin itself, there is a place named St. James's Gate, because that was the point whence pilgrims embarked on their journey to Santiago de Compostela in northern Spain. And, of course, it has another, more colloquial fame, because St. James's Gate, this was even better known to Joyce, St. James's Gate was and is the address of the Guinness Brewery. So, here we are in the middle of a teacher being paid by the man who hired him, and yet we're back in the days of the pilgrims. An old pilgrim's hoard, dead treasure, hollow shells. That is so Aristotelian. The idea of holding memory as part of time. And it informs Joyce's core literary and philosophical beliefs. And in a sense, that's what we've been watching in Stephen since the beginning of this novel. That we are, whether we know or even like it, we are human beings in a continuum. But, Joyce being Joyce, an Irishman being an Irishman, we're also in politics. That line, dead treasure, hollow shells, dead, hollow, emotive words, pejorative words. Mr. Deasy, as we shall see, is a man who wants to be part of the colonial system. And yet, what do colonists amass? Souvenirs of the countries they colonize. They take things and they keep them on their desks. Symbols of power, but symbols only. In other words, colonists only take, Joyce is saying. They rarely give. And, of course, we're also into Homer. What's the final line of this week's quote? A sovereign fell, bright and new, on the soft pile of the tablecloth. When Stephen's parallel character in Homer's Odyssey, Telemachus, the son of absent Odysseus, visits the old man Nestor. A sovereign, by the way, is made of gold, you know that. When Telemachus visits the old man Nestor, the mentor, the instructor, the teacher, the principal, if you like, Stephen, that is to say, Telemachus, you see how complete the transfer is? Telemachus watches Nestor's people prepare a heifer for sacrifice at a feast in Telemachus's honor, because he's the son of the mighty Odysseus. Well, in the chapter, in the Odyssey, in Homer's Odyssey, the goldsmith comes to the table prepared to gild the horns of the heifer, which they're just leading in from the fields, to gild the horns of the heifer before they slaughter the animal and sacrifice it. A sovereign was, and still is, though not in usual currency, a gold coin. And in Homer there is the line. There is the line, Nestor gave out the gold. As Mr. D.C. is doing with Stephen Telemachus, as did in his way James A. Joyce give out the gold. More next week.